Everyone to this afternoon's discussion of the possibility of election breakdown and what we can do about it. My name is Arkan Fung. I'm on the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School. And before we begin, the Ash Center would just like to acknowledge the land on which we sit. Harvard sits on the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We'll dedicate the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time together to respond to your questions. So please, during the conversation, submit questions at any time through the throughout the presentation using the Q&A box. We also want to take this opportunity to let the Harvard community members know about the Harvard Votes Challenge, which is a nonpartisan initiative that strives to build a civic culture of participation here at the university by increasing voter registration and participation across the entire community. We invite all participants to join the movement at Harvard Votes Challenge. at voteschallenge.harvard.edu. At the Kennedy School, we've registered as of this morning 92% of all eligible students, and we're hoping to kick it up a little bit from there. Please note that this event is being recorded and can be found on the Ash Center website and the YouTube channel after this event has concluded. We are exactly 1 week away from the Election Day 2020 on November 3rd. This election is unlike any in my memory and perhaps yours as well. Many Americans are afraid that the most basic process of Americans voting to select their next president may break down. There hasn't been a US election in my lifetime where there has been such serious talk of a national election not working. In a recent Pew Research survey, just 66% of registered voters thought that it was very or somewhat likely that after all the votes are counted, it will be clear who won the election. In our discussion this afternoon, we'll explore what election breakdown could look like, and we will learn about what different organizations and individuals are doing to prevent and prepare to respond in case our election next week does break down somehow. What do people have in mind when they're worried about election breakdown? People are talking about a bunch of different scenarios for election breakdown that we'll dive into. Some of them, President Trump has said many times that he's worried about massive voter fraud, despite the evidence that voter fraud has not been a significant problem in recent US elections. Another version of breakdown is that despite losing the Electoral College vote, President Trump refuses to leave office. A third version is that President Trump wins the Electoral College vote, but loses the popular vote, as he did in 2016. But this time, many Democrats refuse to accept the outcome and engage in civil or militant protest. Some people worry that the vote will be close enough in some swing states to put the Electoral College outcome in doubt. Then we could have a replay of the 2020 election in which the courts render the final decision, or some have even speculated that one or more state legislatures could override or otherwise disregard the popular vote in their states, perhaps because the vote is so close that, or because they can't arrive at a decisive count by their legislative deadlines. We have a fantastic panel here to discuss this topic and what folks are doing about it. I'm really happy to be joined by my colleague and friend Erica Chenoweth, who is a scholar of civil resistance, comparatively speaking, in a lot of different places around the world. She's done a lot of fantastic work, and one of her many projects is documenting the scope and scale and location of all sorts of protest and forms of resistance around the world, kind of ongoing as an ongoing project. Second is Joe Goldman, who is a proud MPP graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School. He is president of the Democracy Fund, which is, I think, safe to say, the major, or at least one of the major funders of democracy work, both protecting democracy and deepening democracy in the United States. They support many, many important projects and organizations. And Vanita Gupta is the president and CEO of the Leadership Committee for Civil and Human Rights. And she is supporting and bringing together lots of different organizations and leaders right now, most relevant to this discussion, to protect our democracy and continue to improve it. So with that, let me turn it over to the speakers, and let me open by asking each of you a question. And it's the same question for Joe, Vanita, and Erica. How worried are you about an election breakdown? Vice President Biden is leading significantly in the polls. The gap seems to be widening. So maybe the prospect of election breakdown is not as present as many people had worried about even just a few weeks ago. So how worried are you? And what kind of breakdown, whether it's one of the scenarios I described above or some other, most concerns you? Maybe I'll kick it to Joe first.
Sure. Thanks, Archon. So look, my general attitude is to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. So it's not, I think it's not so much that I'm worried about some kind of crisis or breakdown. Rather, I think the stakes are really high and the conditions are there for any number of pretty significant and unusual problems to take place. So, I think we need to do what we can to prevent them, to mitigate them, and be prepared for those that could happen. Look, the good news is that people are turning out in this election. More than 67 million people have already cast their vote. I think, it will probably be well beyond 70 million people by the end of the day. That's something to be celebrated. And, I hope the story of this election is one of civic participation, that in spite of an economic recession and a national pandemic, people took responsibility for their democracy, overcoming really remarkable obstacles. I guess what worries me the most are the persistent efforts to undermine the public's confidence in our election system, really as an excuse for losing. We all know that this president will never admit that he lost fairly and will blame corruption or fraud, really no matter what happens, right? That is what he has done and is doing. And what makes me worried about that is not that he's going to lose the election and refuse to leave office, right? That's something to be thinking about, but the law is pretty clear on that matter. What worries me about it is that he is undermining the integrity of the election in the eyes of his supporters, and creating the conditions for post-election violence. What we saw in Michigan with the so-called militia kind of plans against the governor is one example of how amped up, distrustful and angry folks are, and how dangerous it can be when the president of the United States is undermining the integrity of the process. Right?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. So for those of you keeping score in the audience, write that one down. It may not be the breakdown, may not be an immediate breakdown next week, by Thursday or Friday, but it may be this more slow burn in which lots and lots of Americans, which their faith in the electoral process erodes significantly. Erica, what do you think? What scenarios are you worried about? Or maybe you're not worried. Tell me you're not worried.
Well, I hate to disappoint you, Archon. I first of all, thanks for convening us, and thanks to everybody for being here today. I shared Joe's concerns, and I want to flag just one other issue, which is that I think President Trump and his campaign have been pretty openly putting their cards on the table about what their election strategy is. And the election strategy isn't actually to win the popular vote or even to win decisive victories in the Electoral College. I think that the strategy has always been get enough Electoral College votes to marginally win the election and hold on to power. And in the absence of being able to do that, use legal tools to try to challenge ballots, stop counting, and do anything possible to prevent Joe Biden from having the outright 270 Electoral College vote majority that's required for this election to be actually decided directly by voters and the election officials who are delegated the responsibility certifying those results and forwarding them on to Congress. And so over the past week or so, become increasingly concerned that actually the primary playbook here is the one that kind of Robert Reich has been talking about lately, which is simply to batter the legal system with so many lawsuits that some of the swing state elected officials are not actually able to complete counting by the December 8th safe harbor deadline, to make sure that there isn't a clear 270 votes majority in the Electoral College, and that then sends the decision to Congress. And Congress doesn't decide it, who the president is, based on how many Congress people there are in Congress. It's based on how many election delegations there are. And the GOP has a majority of those right now. So, I think the gamble has always been to basically, you win some, you lose some in the legal system, but to try to basically use that in order to get to a position where, in fact, the campaign is protected from the voters, and instead is relying on the legal system for some wins and enablers in the Republican Party to appoint the president.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Erica. As probably some people, as one of the three you probably knows better than I do, there's 300 or 400 lawsuits related to the election, many of them related to COVID circumstances right now, making their way through. And we're still a week out, so the legal court battle is really important. And one thing, this election is a constitutional education, in that many of, myself included, I hadn't really thought much about the contingent election process before a few weeks ago. Vanita, you wrote a great piece in the Washington Post in late September, arguing that the way to fend off democratic breakdown and the broader authoritarian threat is massive. You say massive participation, quote, is the surest way to inoculate our democracy against authoritarian threats. Because if the outcome of the election is very clear, we'll avoid the conflict and confusion of election breakdown. That's the topic of this afternoon's discussion, and that Joe and Erica have opened the conversation with. Now that we're on the eve of the election and 65 million people have voted early, do you think we've reached the kind of massive participation that you're calling for?
So I think it's too early to know, because it depends on how many more people are going to be voting. So I think the high voter turnout right now is really exciting. It's important that people are feeling so energized that in the face of persistent disinformation about the very legitimate, safe, secure voting method called absentee voting or mail-in voting, that it hasn't stopped people from using this. But I think it's too soon to declare a victory and say that this is record turnout, because obviously what happens in the next week is going to shape that. But yes, the record right now is amazing. I do think it is significant to look at kind of places like Texas, where there's been a lot of voter suppression efforts, and voter suppression being in the form of limiting drop boxes in a place like Harris County, which has the population of several states, to long lines and the like. That you're seeing this kind of enthusiasm that is keep getting people out. It may even be energizing voters, actually. But the reason why I wrote that Washington Post piece, and the reason why I talk about this a lot, is that to me the greatest concern there, if we spend all of this time just kind of talking through the threats and catastrophizing, the danger is that voters become demoralized or feel like the system is rigged in advance, and it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in a lot of ways, I mean, the one silver lining is I think there is a kind of civic education that a lot of us are getting for the first time, because of the kinds of threats we've been dealing with, not just in this election season, but threats to our democracy for the last several years in the Trump administration, that we can't take these things for granted. But I also think that there's a danger in voter suppression. Isn't just about the impediments that get erected before voters. It's also about the kind of intentional fear mongering and disinformation that can happen. and I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about this. I think there's just a couple of facts that we should all know, which is that elections in this country are almost always hard fought. They're often contentious. There are disputes about how elections are conducted, which ballots are counted, who won the most votes sometimes continues well past election day. We saw this in primaries that had to take time to count absentee ballots and didn't have results for a while. We have to understand that some of this is a normal part of our elections, and not kind of become too focused on these threats that can have an impact on voters, especially before November 3rd. And there is a way in which, if we have high voter turnout and we have a decisive win, whichever way it goes, that courts are going to stay out of the business of deciding elections. I think it's also important to recognize that only once in our nation's history has the court, and this was 2000, really determined the outcome of an election. There is a lot of litigation, as you said, Archon. There's record amounts of pre-election litigation right now, 300 to 400 cases. As you said, most of it driven by COVID around election administration, where civil rights groups and Democrats have been fighting to open up voter options amid this pandemic. And the Republican Party largely has been fighting to close those down. But a lot of this is aimed at averting litigation after. It's about setting up the rules for which, how people are going to vote and which ballots are going to be counted. And so it is unlikely that even in some of these terrible nightmare scenarios that you laid out at the top, rival slate of electors, governors and state legislatures determining a slate of electors that doesn't reflect the will of the voters, this type of thing, that actually in those instances, they're going to become political questions that are going to go to Congress. And there's anyone can go to electiontaskforce.org to kind of understand the legal parameters around this and around all of these scenarios. I would really recommend it. But so I think like a lot of the rules are actually getting set right now. It is not to take away, and as Joe said, I am hopeful, but I prepare for the worst. A lot of us have been building up the infrastructure ready to defend our democracy, to ensure that every voter can actually vote and then have their ballot counted after. And we are going to be ready. But this public messaging actually really matters for voter confidence in the system. And if the courts, I know there's a lot of additional anxiety, myself included, around when Justice Ginsburg passed and yesterday night's confirmation of a justice who's been decidedly anti-civil rights and anti-voting rights now joining the court. But understand that most of the litigation that we will see after the election will never see the Supreme Court. And it's not to reassure folks. We want to, again, high voter turnout is the best inoculation. But the goal is, again, a lot of these rules have been set and there will be litigation. When people ask me how many days is it going to take to know the results, is it 2 days? Is it 3 days? And I'm like, I don't know. In December, there's a deadline by which the states have to certify their slate of electors to Congress. That is a deadline. And that will be when litigation absolutely has to be decided, ended, or else left in the open that's where you're going to see the concern around the rival slate of electors. But there are systems built into our democracy that prevent the president from kind of being the person to count the ballots, and a lot of misinformation about all of this. You can have a lot of threats out there, but it's important for us to understand what the rules of our system are and to understand that there are a lot of people that are going to be defending it.
Great. Thank you very much. And I just want to bring out a point that Joe and Vanita have been stressing, which I hear you as having the need for us all to be critical, but not cynical citizens, right? So we have to be pretty clear-eyed about the flaws in the process. But even as we're clear-eyed, we have to ourselves participate a lot and encourage everyone we know to participate. So I was looking at I think it was a Morning Consult poll. Only 18% of voters think that the 2020 election will definitely be free and fair. Another 32% think that it probably will be, but 48 respond that it's not likely or definitely won't be free and fair, right? So there's all sorts of questions. And, if you have one kind of political persuasion, you're worried about voter fraud. If you have another, you're worried about voter suppression and other other factors, legal factors. Maybe you're worried about the electoral college. All of these things cast into doubt the freeness and fairness of the election, but that is no reason not to participate. That's a reason to participate for the reasons that Vanita was laying out so clearly. All right. So Joe, for this one's for you. You and I have talked for several years now about the possibility of conflict and election unrest. It seemed a little more abstract. I think at least I recall it as being a little more abstract when we were having those conversations. As president of the Democracy Fund, you've been doing a lot more than talking, though. You've been supporting people and organizations to understand this, to map this out, to prepare to respond. What are some of their plans in November if the election breaks down? Like, what are people thinking about how they might respond? Oh, you're muted. Joe, you're muted.
Yeah, I think when you and I first started talking about this stuff, I always felt a little bit like I had a tinfoil hat on when I would bring these issues up, because it felt kind of crazy and conspiracy minded. And I have felt less and less embarrassed about bringing these kinds of topics up as we've gotten closer to this election. I totally agree with Vanita's core point here, right? That the best way that you head off a problem is through normal politics. And, most of what our grantees have been doing are the stuff of democracy, right? They have been working to make it easier to vote, like Democracy Works, a group that came out of the Kennedy School. They've been working to pass reforms to ensure that people can vote without risking their health. They've been working to strengthen our system of election administration. They've been working to ensure that people have the information they need to make up their minds how to vote. Our grantees have recruited more than 700,000 poll workers. They've provided direct assistance to thousands of jurisdictions to help them carry out the election. So like that's the stuff that's going to be most important to prevent problems. But we certainly have supported a number of groups who have been thinking about how to prepare for and respond to various kinds of election crises. Our grantee Protect Democracy convened the bipartisan task force on election crises that Vanita is on, and you heard her reference. They have kind of brought together this bipartisan group of experts to kind of game out the different kinds of scenarios that could play out and think about the kinds of things that every kind of sector and leader in our society could do to reduce the likelihood that those crises could take place. We have funded grantees like Election SOS, which has been training journalists about how to responsibly cover an election during a pandemic and how to prepare for the different kinds of scenarios that could unfold. What does it look like to responsibly cover each of those scenarios in a way that informs readers and doesn't inflame and encourage the problem? We've supported efforts like Issue One's Count Every Vote campaign, which has been running ads to help folks recognize that, what's most important is that every vote is counted, even if it takes a bit more time. And, look, in the end, that's the most important message, right? We can all agree on, right? In an election, every vote must be counted, and we must resist any effort to infringe on that principle. We must demand it. And, to the extent that the most concerning scenarios involve some effort to cut off the counting process, which, as Vanita said, like, we have laws and rules and procedures in place to preserve and protect, but the last backstop is our demanding it. And I think Erica can talk more about this, especially from the international experience. But at the end of the day, if the courts are filled up with disputes and the threat is really out there, then people need to exercise their First Amendment rights to demonstrate and demand that our democracy uphold the rule of law. And I'll maybe hand it to Erica to dig into what it looks like to make those demands. But
yeah, that's great. Erica, I think I first heard about the Hold the Line project from you. Can you talk a bit about that effort, how you became engaged with it, and then the other efforts that you know about or thinking about working with or engaged with to think about this First Amendment response in case of election breakdown and other kinds of responses to election breakdown?
Well, like Joe, I too want to echo my total agreement with everything that Vanita said in terms of the need to both reinforce and normalize how important it is for people to vote and participate and have their votes counted and to support the election process. And that's the number one way, as she said, to avert a crisis is to have a clear kind of victory for one of the candidates, such that it doesn't even become kind of like worth it to challenge the results from the other side. But I also think that normal politics in our country often do have some different effects on people, based on where they live and who they are, and that it's okay to tell the truth that our normal political system does sometimes leave people out or bring about outcomes that people feel are unfair, like the removal of ballot boxes during a pandemic, or the closure of polling stations to expressly limit the ability of people to cast their ballots, or kind of feigning incompetence within the USPS to delay the delivery of mail-in ballots that in some key states and now the Supreme Court has decided won't be counted after election night. And so, I agree with you. Overwhelming popular participation is the way to mitigate against this, and we should support everyone in their efforts to participate and have their voices heard through their ballots at this time. And I also agree with Joe that having a backup plan, as my colleague Robert Blair and others have argued, is good. So having a plan to vote and a plan to protest together is just having a backup plan and insurance policy to make sure that I stay attached to my ballot as it goes through the process and make sure that it's counted and make sure that my voice is heard. And if it isn't, that I make the demands of the people whose responsibility it is to serve our electoral process, that they will do that, and they will make sure that it's done for everyone. And in terms of the sort of Protect the Results coalition and then the Hold the Line group, Protect the Results is another of these sort of bipartisan organizations that developed out of an effort of Indivisible and Stand Up Republic to count every vote and to make sure that that people participate and that they are prepared to mobilize in some kind of mass mobilization in response. And the reason for this is because, when we look at cases around the world where there are efforts to sort of steal or undermine elections by incumbent leaders, one of the most powerful ways to avert that is through mass mobilization. And so I think they're guided by those international examples. And then the Hold the Line group is basically another group of activists and organizers who've tried to map out what would happen after mass protests. Like, what do mass protests actually achieve? How are they designed in the context of an overall campaign? And how people can organize to affect the decisions of elected officials or local media or, for example, police and others to secure pledges that they will respect the process and protect people exercising their First Amendment rights and so forth. And so that one is really trying to encourage people to feel empowered where they are to put together their own kind of community organizations and begin to mobilize from the grassroots. And it's very much linked to other groups like Choose Democracy, which is another kind of pledge campaign, which George Lakey is sort of calling an insurance policy. But everybody agrees, everybody oriented around these efforts agrees that casting the ballot and getting out the vote is the most important thing people can be doing at this stage.
And can I just say a couple of quick things on this?
Yeah, please, Vanita, go ahead.
So, and I just think it's important also to understand the context in which this election is happening. So, you know, we had massive protests all summer long after George Floyd's murder. And, you know, the energy in this country is high in the democracy protection space, and also kind of fighting for racial justice. And so I think that it would be unrealistic to think that if people are anxious about whether we're going to have a fair election, of course, you know, there's going to be, I think, people out in the streets to protect it. And I think this is the goal, though, is to keep everyone safe, because I think that there is nothing more that Trump would like than chaos in the streets. And, you know, there's been a lot of intel gathered about armed militia. We've seen some of this stuff come to pass. I was just on a call with Mary McCord and several folks who've been thinking a lot about this with law enforcement as well, about de-escalation, about both protecting voters, you know, before November 3rd and making sure that everyone understands that voter intimidation is against the law and that public officials are going to stand up for that. But then after, kind of understanding that to the extent people are going to take to the streets, whether there have been containers created for it, like, you know, ones that we've been talking about, or it's going to be organic, that people are safe, and that there isn't making sure, I think the narrative that gets created around this is also really important, because there will be a battle of the narratives, and then there's going to be, and I think we should all understand this, that regardless of who is actually out in the street, that the movement for Black Lives will get blamed for everything. And so it is really important to also bring a racial justice analysis to kind of the mobilization efforts that are happening, and making sure that we are doing everything that we can in this moment. And we, you know, a lot of communities have seen, have taken to the streets at great risk to themselves or to their communities, but to do what we can to have infrastructure in place to keep people safe if they are, you know, out to protest and safeguard their democracy, because there are counter forces at play that we are seeing more emboldened, white supremacists, armed militia, more emboldened than ever before in this country, in recent memory at least. And so that has been part of the preparedness that we are bringing to this moment, even as are talking about the kind of the legal piece of this and the GOTV getting out the vote piece of this. It is trying to make sure that we are all understanding kind of the energy in this country, and making sure that we can do everything that we can to both keep people safe and not lose control of the narrative about what this is all about.
Great, thank you. I want to follow up a little bit on this protest thread before we move on from it. The New York Times did an interesting retrospective in 2000 on the Florida recount. And I didn't remember this episode, but according to the retrospective, a key event was the Brooks Brothers protest. So they're recounting ballots. I think maybe it was in Broward County, or maybe it was Miami-Dade. And they're recounting in the county office where they do the recount. And there's this huge protest. And the cry of the protest is voter fraud, massive voter fraud, even though there's no evidence to support that. But the response to that protest is that they stopped counting the ballots. They just said, okay, well, we're not going to count them. We're not going to continue the recount. So it's this protest that had this like a domino effect on an official part of the process to count the ballots, the manual count that stopped, that had these enormous consequences. So this time around, for the reasons that Vanita and Erica are saying, I imagine that if that happened again in some swing state, that it would be met with counter protest from the left to say, hey, look, there's not massive fraud. You can't intimidate these election officials. What do you think about the possibilities? How do you keep people safe? How do you prevent that protest and counter protest into some kind of escalation that a lot of people would end up regretting, and probably perhaps people getting hurt as a result of it?
I think we're all handing off to another. Look, I mean, yeah. So look, I think, you know, one of the things that there's a lot that's different between now and 2000. You know, and I think part of what is different is the movement organizers that Vanita was talking about have grown more and more sophisticated about how to organize these kinds of protests in a way that has some level of discipline and plan, and is aimed at de-escalating when necessary, and keeping folks safe, right? And so I think, part of what needs to happen is letting the folks who have been leading these efforts to lead these efforts. And, I think we also have a responsibility to pay attention to the overall message and to focus attention on where there is joy in this election, and where there is the excitement and the good stories, and the stories of the 100-year-old grandmother who makes it out to vote against all sorts of obstacles, right? There's an opportunity to be telling heroic, exciting, positive stories in this election to capture the message of kind of voting rights, and not to allow folks to allow this kind of voter fraud frame to dominate. And I think that becomes really important beyond just being prepared, right?
Very good. How about Vanita and then Erica?
Well, just to Joe's point, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And we have to celebrate the high voter turnout, the Joy to the Polls effort. I just love it. The videos of people dancing in 6 feet apart, of course, but like outside of the polling lines, and while they're waiting, the long lines are a big problem that we have to fix. And I know we're going to get to some of the longer term structural solutions we have to work on, but there is this level of celebration and joy that we have to be uplifting, that media has to be uplifting, rather than just kind of stoking the anxiety. But just on this thing of keeping people safe, I mean, these movement groups, as Joe said, they are sophisticated. I mean, we're all taking precautions, but we are doing things that are as concrete as, in 20 cities where we, may anticipate that there could be mobilization, that there are connections between community leaders and public safety agencies and mayor's offices, so that in real time there can be de-escalation or reporting of our militia or the like. That's the kind of thing that a Justice Department back in the day would have sought to do. And so the NGO community and civil society is doing that type of thing. We're doing planning as much as possible around making sure that there's connectivity with the mayors, the U.S. Conference of Mayors and law enforcement associations and community leaders. So in the end, I think there's the legal piece of this, there's the mobilization. There's also, just because I saw a question in the chat about, well, a lot of people may not feel comfortable protesting amid COVID, which is very understandable. What else can they do? The campaigns are also going to be, for the week after, doing chase and cure, meaning that they're going to be reaching out to voters and trying to ensure that if there were mistakes on their ballots, that they can correct them, and they will be recruiting people to sign up to be volunteers in that effort. It is just as getting out the vote is a huge effort, this chase and cure period for the week after the election is a big endeavor and requires people to be able to do that. So that may be a way to plug in to safeguard your democracy. So, and in any case, I think there's a lot of different things that we are doing, but let's not lose sight of the kind of celebration that we should be uplifting, that the media also, they're going to need content. And the worst thing that they can do after November 3rd is to go down these catastrophe spirals and freak everyone out. I think having some positive stories, and also talking about if there are problems that we are documenting in real time about voter suppression and barriers, that we're looking to what are the solutions to address, that we can fix this come the next election cycle. Because I think there is a much stronger appetite for this and a much greater realization for why the country needs this more today than ever before.
Very good. Erica.
Yeah, I would just add to what's been shared, that some communities aren't in a position to, nor do they feel safe trying to liaise directly with their police departments at this time, particularly in the context of the racial justice uprisings of the summer and the aftermath. And one of the options there is for some communities to instead try to secure pledges, right? So there's one of the kind of guidance pieces from the Hold the Line group and Choose Democracy is actually to at least try to get police and mayor's offices and the like on record as saying that they will, in the aftermath of the election, if there are people engaged in peaceful protests, that they will do whatever they can to protect their First Amendment rights and protect them from violence from others. There is also, I think, a growing understanding among many people involved in many of these coalitions that street protest is not really the only and even the most effective game in town. And then in fact, at times when there are potentials for violence to escalate, even if nobody wants it to, that actually stay-at-home demonstrations and other forms of nonviolent action that are forms of non-cooperation and not going to the streets can actually be both more disruptive in some ways and more powerful, but also much safer. And that's particularly true during the pandemic time, as someone was saying, in terms of things that are safe to do and don't risk the same escalations to violence, but can also keep pressure on. I will post some examples of this in the chat in a moment. And then the last thing I would say is that there is, I think, a lot of focus, as Joe and Vanita have said, on trying to get that organizational capacity in shape for kind of rapid response to different types of scenarios. But the most important thing is just to equip people with this sense that there are skills that can be learned in advance of a protest, like conflict de-escalation, like kind of training oneself for nonviolent discipline. There are lots of organizations that do work around accompaniment and other things that can really help in these times to really tone, kind of slow things down, really is the key. And so it doesn't have to be a matter of everybody's kind of quiet or there's chaos in the streets. There's a very disciplined kind of mass mobilization that is possible, that's been used in many other countries and in fact has been used in the United States around voting rights and decades past. And that all of us, as people who live here, have constitutionally protected rights to engage in. So I think that's just the only thing I'd add on that.
That's great. Fantastic. We did an event just last week with the secretaries of state, some secretaries of state from swing states, Jocelyn Benson from Michigan and Frank LaRose from Ohio and Kathy Bookfar from Pennsylvania. And I think it was Jocelyn that said, us secretaries of state, we're the guardians of democracy. And I thought that was like a great image and term. I just hadn't heard it before applied to secretaries of state. And that's a very positive story to tell. But I think a bunch of people on the Zoom right now are interested themselves in being guardians of democracy. And just to continue this thread, several people asked in the registration and in the Q&A what they can do on election day, maybe in the lead up to election day, in the days after, to protect our democracy. If maybe they're not signed up to these organizations, it's not what they do for their day job, unlike some of us. And so what else do you have, if you have other thoughts about how people can be guardians of democracy in the weeks ahead? What can people do? And we'll definitely post some resources in the chat and so on.
Resources too, so I'm looking forward to posting them in the chat. I think before.
Oh, Vanita, you're breaking down. Your audio is breaking down just a touch. Okay.
So why don't I start, and Vanita will chime in when she joins back. And look, it looks like from some folks in the chat that people are calling in from other countries. I think what they can do is probably a bit limited in the U.S. But I think that the most important thing with a week out, right, is to ensure that every friend you have, every colleague you have, every family member you have has a plan to vote. And if they have not cast their ballot already, to do so as soon as possible, and really use a Dropbox if possible. I think today is kind of the last day if you were planning to send something in the mail that you might want to do that. I think this idea of bringing joy to the process is real. One of the grantees that we support is a group called Pizza to the Polls, which essentially, has food trucks and provides pizzas to folks who are waiting in lines, and folks can support any number of efforts like that, which matters and I think is important. You can celebrate to what you were saying. You can celebrate Election Hero Day, which is Monday, November 2nd, the day before elections, is a day to celebrate and thank the election administrators and poll workers and election officials who have the thankless job of running this election. These are the first responders of our election. And one of the nice things about this idea of Election Hero Day and thanking these folks beyond just being grateful is it reminds Americans that the folks who run their elections are their neighbors. Right. It's not some secret cabal in Washington, D.C. that's running your election. It is somebody in your community who cares about your community and is running this election. And I think being able to express gratitude to these folks is a reminder of that, which is important. And the last thing I'd say is, like, look, beyond doing things like being a poll worker and being a poll watcher and supporting voter turnout, like, we can also take responsibility for how we spread information, right? And before you send that tweet, before you post that next thing to Facebook, actually, like, checking it and making sure that it's accurate, and thinking critically about the information that is flowing through your ecosystem. Because, one of the most important conditions that exacerbates the kinds of problems we're talking about is these echo chambers that we're living in, and the speed with which misinformation flows, right? So yeah, but Vanita, since you're back, I'll let you jump in.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's great now. Yeah,
Joe said what I was going to say, which aside from being a poll worker and voting and getting your friends and family to vote, fighting disinformation and actually being able to be a purveyor of accurate information and a purveyor of calm after the election with your friends and community, I think is also really important. The Leadership Conference has done a lot of work with other orgs to set up all kinds of guidelines and enforcement, increased rigor at Facebook and Twitter around fighting disinformation after the election. But the role that each of us play is going to be really crucial in ensuring that we are making sure that we're looking at credible sites for information on this. There is going to be a lot of disinformation and efforts to intentionally distort what's happening in our democracy after, and we have to, that's a role that each of us should and I think really must play.
Yeah, thank you very much. So so we've got patience, we've got informational responsibility and integrity, and we've got celebration. And of course, Australia has the tradition of democracy sausages on election day, which I love. During the Georgia primary, Ashley Judd sent a bunch of rib trucks to LaTosha Brown's organization, Black Voters Matter, all over Georgia, which was fantastic. I think would be good to see some more of that. One of the questions, this is from somebody who's joining from the UK, Tim Kell. This is a little more kind of forward-looking, and it's about the U.S.'s reputation in the world as this beacon of democracy. And now maybe that kind of reputation is being trashed. Do you think that the era of America in the world is standing for democratic advancement? That we're kind of seeing the sunset on that, given how things are going right now?
Sorry, I'm reading about election day cakes based on the link that was just posted in the chat. But I don't think anybody knows what the long-term impact of these past 4 years are going to be, right? It is indisputable that our place in the world has changed dramatically, and rightfully so. given the behavior of these past 4 years. I think people should look at this nation's commitment to democracy with far more skepticism than they have in the past. And I think part of looking forward is about kind of doubling down on our commitment to creating a more open and just democracy. And, I think all of our hope is that if and when we're able to turn the page and start a new chapter, that, in the same way that following Watergate, there were the Watergate babies and the Watergate reforms, that we have a moment to create a stronger democracy. Right?
Also, and I want to definitely hear what Erica has to say about this with her international lens on it, but I will say that the attacks certainly by the government on our democratic norms and institutions and practices have been immense, and that this election to me does present a choice of democracy versus authoritarianism in really profound ways. But I also think that so the reputation has been undoubtedly hurt, but I think looking at civil society, and maybe this is giving us all a pat on the back that we don't deserve, but I think it has been amazing how civil society in this moment has really risen to this challenge on pushing back, using every tool possible, despite the fact that there have been very limited tools given, the kind of consolidation of the Republican Party around the president, which has undermined fundamental checks and balances in our democracy. And so I think that is something to say. I will say that I don't think this is about looking back in 10 or 20 years to assess this moment. What we do if there is political change in Washington to address the fact that increasingly it feels like we have minority rule, whether it's because of the courts, whether it's because of the Electoral College, whether it's because of how incredibly rigged our democracy has been. And it's why for the Leadership Conference and other progressive organizations and civil rights organizations, HR 1, HR 4, DC statehood, these big pieces of structural reform legislation have to be a top priority. This election and the last several years have given us enough data points to make the case for why it is high time that we ensure and protect our democracy. And there are things that we can actually do by law to do this. And so I think we are building that case, and it will be the work on this is not going to end after, because of the election. After that, it's about pushing our agenda, even if there is change, and making sure and holding accountable those that have been elected to actually address these very long-standing structural problems that are only going to continue to plague us the more multiracial and more diverse we become, and the more in stark contrast power is, the allocation of power is.
Very good. Erica.
Yeah, I'll just pick up where Vanita left off. I think what she said there toward the end is really salient too to where the U.S. stands in the world, and it reminds me of work by people like the historian Gail Plummer and others who argued that discrimination and systemic racism against Black people in this country was a major reason why the U.S. didn't rise to the levels of respect that it could have had during the Cold War, and during World War II and the immediate aftermath of that. Similarly, it has always been something that has held the U.S. back from realizing the potential that it might have as being an example of how a democracy can improve the experiment of democracy and heal wounds like the ones that are left unhealed in this country, and to expand the protection of rights for others and to become a more egalitarian democracy. And the fact that has been laid bare for us through the persistent mobilization of Black-led organizations in this country over the past really 8 years at this point, helps to show us again that this is the way that we need to sort of address the primary deficits of our country and the ways that it could potentially restore itself to a position of leadership and example in the world.
Thank you very much for that. Just for the last few minutes, why don't we continue this conversation that looks beyond next week to the longer term democracy questions. And this election, I think at the moment, has revealed lots of weaknesses that many of us didn't really fully realize in our electoral apparatus. And one possibility is after the election, the democratic process issues will become low salience and people will say, it's just fine, let's just move on. Another possibility is that that we'll remember how problematic some of these institutions and practices that we've lived with for a long time are. There's a question in the chat about the Electoral College. In our colleague Alex Kazar's book is a long history of the Electoral College. I think in part of that history, Joe Biden voted to keep the Electoral College. It was non-problematic. Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia were confirmed by something like 96, 97 to 3 or 4, right? As non-problematic, the court's confirmation process. But now something about our times, perhaps the extent to which people disagree with one another on fundamental policy issues, reveals some of the weaknesses in this democratic apparatus. So what should we do if we have 4 years or 8 years or how many years to fix it? What should we do so that we don't find ourselves in this situation again in 2024 or 2028, in which we're worried about the very conduct of the election? Anybody? Joe, why don't you jump in?
Well, I'd say I'll follow Vanita, I think, on this one.
So at the risk of repeating myself, I actually think there's a pretty solidly marked out agenda, although we have to now be able to make sure that we are adding to it to address a lot of what we're learning in this election cycle. But, there were a set of bills that passed the House of Representatives in 2019 that have just been languishing in Mitch McConnell's legislative graveyard for the last 2 years. One of them was For the People Act, HR 1, which is a comprehensive democracy reform bill that focuses on voting rights, money in politics, judicial ethics. It's a big, wide sweeping bill that would address a lot of the problems that we've been dealing with and make sure that there's federal law around automatic voter registration, same-day registration, really a slew of voting rights reforms. HR 4 would restore the Voting Rights Act under a formula that would address current day conditions on racial discrimination in voting. The Supreme Court gutted that the Voting Rights Act, one of the most successful pieces of federal legislation in our nation's history back in 2013. And without it, has left a lot of states with these histories really open to be bold in voter suppression. And so that's another one. DC statehood is something that has been long on the books. There's been a huge push for it. It would, the disenfranchisement of DC residents has been a big issue. And then I think there are big questions right now around the filibuster, the elimination of alternatives to the Electoral College that might better reflect the will of the people. And there's a very vigorous conversation going on right now about court expansion and court reform, given kind of that Trump has confirmed in quite a record speed about 25% of the nation's federal judges who serve lifetime appointments, and then also on the Supreme Court. So there's these are all going to be a part of the conversation, but I would say those first 3 efforts are ones that already have passed the House of Representatives and need to be picked up, but there needs to be a grassroots kind of hunger and demand for this, because we will lose sight of this. There's no question. There are a lot of competing priorities for any new administration, and they're all very serious: climate, immigration, healthcare. But I think we have to understand that we have been, as progressives, really good at being single issue fighters. And oftentimes these issues of structural power and reopening our democracy so it works for all of us get thrown to the side when they are the heart of being able to do and win and save those wins on these other issues.
Thank you very much. Joe or Erica? Joe.
I mean, I think we're probably about out of time. I do need to jump, but I agree with everything Vanita said, and I think the overriding message here, right, is there's not a silver bullet, right? There's not one, if we just fix this one thing, everything's going to be better. We need to unrig the system. We need to rebuild the norms that Donald Trump has trampled. We need to continue to grow the movement for racial justice. We need to achieve full participation in our democracy. We need to hold digital platforms accountable for their role in our public square, and rebuild and rebuild local media to earn the trust of the communities they serve. All while thinking about how we reweave our social fabric. Like these are all critical things that are going to need to happen, right?
Erica, any last words?
No, I think they comprehensively answered it very well.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for this fantastic discussion about an issue of huge urgency at a historic moment, what will certainly be an historic moment in our democratic memory. And thank you for your incredible wisdom and guidance on how to be a good citizen, critical, but not cynical, participatory, patient, and focused on doing the right thing this week and next week, but also in the longer term. Have a great afternoon, everyone.